Hello, it is February the 18th, 2022. This is As the World Burns. I'm your host, Randall Burns. Today's topic is a follow-up to The Fourth Turning. It is about the film Generation Zero, written and directed by Stephen Bannon. Now, I consider this to be kind of a strange film. It does have a forecasting component. A big part of the film is predicated around predicting a crisis. Now, the film it's a 2010 film, so we have 12 years of perspective by which to judge the remaining 8 years that are coming up. Okay. Now, it's also rather timely. Part of the prediction of the Fourth Turning was there would be a war and a crisis, and that actually seems to be perhaps shaping up in the Ukraine and Taiwan as we speak. There'll be more on that soon. But it's okay. The film is a very partisan film. I got to warn you that right off. This is a film written by and for Republicans to organize the faithful. It does not it doesn't cover much of the other side except in disparaging terms. Okay. And the most critical examples they could find. Okay. But there's also some stuff in this that's just kind of bizarre. A lot of the film is highly critical of what they call the 60s generation, focusing on the counterculture. And it's kind of bizarre because when you look at the list of people talking in the film, they're disparaging the boomers as being a spoiled, narcissistic generation. But most of the sources in the film are, in fact, people from the boomer generation, which is just kind of strange. I mean, and they are as much boomers. In fact, the rise of evangelical conservatism that started in this era may be more of a boomer phenomenon than the counterculture is in a lot of ways. And this is something that needs to be looked at, I think, carefully. Okay. They also don't talk about the background of what was going on in the 60s and 70s. It's just, they're only looking at the facts that fit their worldview, not trying to take a balanced look at them. Okay. Now, another thing about the Strauss-Howel generational theory is it was looking at Anglo-America. Now, by the time the 60s happened, the United States was far less Anglo-American than it had been. That was still a core culture for much of the United States, but that was changing very fast, especially due to the 1965 Immigration Act, which I've written in other sources very much in depth. And Strauss and Howel do indicate that they think that these cycles do not hold for all countries. And there's a legitimate question of when the United States got transformed by the 1965 Immigration Act and the prior immigration that wound up in the mid-20s, which was also very, very large. It reshaped the United States. Do these cycles still hold? And I haven't seen any examination on that. Now, that's kind of outside of the thrust of this film, right? The thrust of this film, as far as I can tell, is Democrats are leading the United States to ruin, and the only answer is for people to get more conservative and Republican. And that's basically what I'm seeing. Now, there is some criticism of the older guard of business Republicans within this film. They didn't go into it in depth. I thought it was kind of strange that the film production crew was Citizens United, and they criticize money and politics in the film, but they don't, and the embrace of Democrats of money and politics and getting cozy with business entities, but they don't mention that a lot of this arose under leaders that they in fact endorsed and supported very enthusiastically. There just isn't a lot of examination on that. And many of the boomer icons that they depict in the film aren't in fact boomers, like Tim Leary, and they criticize money and politics in the film, but they don't, and the embrace of Democrats of money and politics and getting cozy with business entities, but they don't mention that a lot of this arose under leaders that they in fact endorsed and supported very enthusiastically. There just isn't a lot of examination on that. And many of the boomer icons that they depict in the film aren't in fact boomers, like Tim Leary and Abby Hoffman, for example, are in the film. And I find it just a little strange. I just wish, I'm not asking these people to not be faithful to their beliefs. They have every entitlement to do that. But I'm just saying, be accurate about the story you're telling. Explain the bigger picture on this. Okay. Now, one thing that they missed also is the hippie subculture is actually predated the 60s by quite a bit. In the United States, it was a factor in Los Angeles in the 1920s, 1930s, somewhere in there. And it was something that was kind of ready to be ramped up. It was separate from the beatnik culture, which was a bigger thing in the 50s, mainly in the New York metropolitan area. But that's something that they just missed. Okay. Another thing they missed is that, again, you have to look at the intra-generational divide within this 60s generation and the boomer generation in general. There were as many boomers that voted for Ronald Reagan as Jimmy Carter, at least the second time around. Excuse me, when Reagan was running, which was, I would argue, was a very decisive election. Now, they do mention Saul Alinsky. He was active at the University of Chicago area. I never met him. He died before I got there. But I did meet, I knew quite well one of his rivals in the socialist movement in that era. That was Maynard Kruger, who I mentioned in another video, or I have another video dedicated to him. Okay, I knew him quite well, and they specifically, specifically mention, okay, essentially that that boomers getting into Wall Street caused financial Armageddon. Now, this is just kind of strange to me because that really wasn't where the action was for that age group. In the 1980s, there were more millionaires made at Microsoft than all of Wall Street combined. And let's not mention Silicon Valley, which was also a factor. Wall Street was becoming something of a backwater during this period. And you need to kind of go into that, okay? There is also a very good article that I will link to on this that has to do with drugs and the financial crisis and Wall Street, okay? And quite frankly, the drug taste of the Wall Street crowd were certainly very different than the hippie movement. They lean more towards cocaine, which has, from what I have seen, does have very severe mental health effects. And I've seen that it's epidemic in the financial industry. And I'll link to an article by David Nutt, who was former UK drug czar, on this. And I think that he was spotting something very real. I saw this in a corporate fraud investigation that I worked on, and I came to the conclusion that that mandatory drug testing there should be mandatory drug testing for all corporate officers and all licensed financial professionals. Cocaine and other people's money is just not a good combination. And so far, I'm the only person I know that's written on that topic. So anyhow, they look at the kind of the cultural upheavals, right? And I would argue that maybe about 20% of the boomer generation was involved in the counterculture in any sort of significant way. But they don't look into into what was forming this. That is covered in a book to a degree in a book by Elizabeth Warren, The Two Income Trap, and Ed Wolf, who's one of the finest economists active in recent decades, has gone into this. Also, another person whose work I recommend is that of George Borjas at Harvard University. Ed Wolf's at NYU, and these are economists that I truly do respect. Okay, and basically, according to Ed Wolf, basically wealth accumulation among Americans ceased outside of the upper 5% around 1965. As a group. Now there are exceptions, there are individual exceptions, but we're talking about the wealth accumulation machine got contained. Now the other thing that happened there that George Borjas mentions was the 1965 Immigration Act. Now that I think in the late 60s and 70s was mainly impacting people in the agricultural sector and certain elements of like construction and places where non-English speakers could work, construction, restaurant work. But it did have a real impact on blue-collar young men. It made it much more difficult for them to get the kind of job that would enable them to support a family, as Elizabeth Warren notes in her book. And perhaps some of the counterculture excesses that they noted have roots in maybe it was becoming more difficult for people to nest and form families. The conservative thinker that I respect on this one is Steve Saylor from VDARE, and he wrote a book on affordable family formation. Wrote an article on affordable family formation. That needs to be backtracked over time to show how that was disturbing patterns there. So I think essentially you had within the boomer generation, you had the folks who just gave up on a traditional family and went into the counterculture and did something else. And then you had the folks that really hunkered down and were as conformist as they could possibly be to appeal for family help and mentorship within the corporate world that was available to a limited degree. So there was a bifurcation there. I think that's a more accurate depiction of what was going on there. And the thing is that this is as much of a boomer film as it is anything else. They just can't acknowledge that within themselves, that they are part of this fourth turning phenomenon that Strauss and Howel talk about. They're too close to it to see it. Okay, and they may actually be contributing to this being a self-fulfilling prophecy. In fact, I'm sure that the GRU and Putin's people have not lost the fact that there is an element of people that have been relatively friendly to them that are expecting this to happen, and they may just be arranging for the crisis they predicted to happen right on time. So that may be happening as we speak. These are bright people. They certainly follow the literature in America very thoroughly. But I don't think that this is a movie that's going to make you a better predictor. It does show you some of the flaws in an overly rigid predictive framework, and there's I think that the Strauss Howel theory, I think that it could be tightened up, but there's a lot of work that goes to making that happen. And Bannon just shows you the foibles of taking something way too literally and without a lot of critical examination. But I have to admit, the man has been a brilliant tactician in terms of things like the Trump campaign of 2016. This was a slick trick, and you see that in the film. Okay, and the again, the economic analysis in the film is really poor. Focusing on income instead of assets, asset accumulation, change in financial position is just an inexcusable mistake, and hides like what really happened. And in terms of generational experience, you also need to look at things like the gender ratio at different points along the curve. I'll link to an article that discusses the research of Marcia Guttag, a very brilliant sociologist from Harvard, who was uncomfortable with what her results showed and didn't publish until after it was published after she died. Okay. Go into the things like the student loan debt emerging. This started, for the boomer generation, really in earnest with the mid-boomer generation. There were people for whom this was just not an issue. The people that, for example, Ann Coulter says, got a 4-year vacation paid for by their parents. This is not a universal experience by any means. The 1965 Immigration Act, I linked to George Borjas's article. This was a huge change in the deal. There's an article that I will mention. It's called Generational Justice by Tim Taylor at the University of Minnesota, then at University of Minnesota. I think this was a very good article. It did not get a good reception, but he basically looked at tax burden paid versus benefits expected to be received. This was steadily getting worse for the boomer generation born from 1955 onward. And it bottomed out for the people for the early part of Generation X, according to Taylor. I have not been able to find a good link to that article. I'll give you the mention to it, so if you want to go to a library and look it up, you possibly can. But there have been regional and class dimensions here, and that you need to look at that in that context. And I think that the Strauss-Howell theory needs to become much more fluid, and not just look at these fixed boundaries. I think that if you look at this as a cycle that is fluid, you'll get better results on this. Okay. I mean, the boomer to the extent that there is a generational boundary, 1955 would be a key year. That was actually the demographic peak. Okay, the boom started around 1945, but there were people that came around slightly beforehand that had more of the generational experience. The experience of the 60s was really included people born a bit earlier than 1945. And people that were coming to age in that period. One of the things that Tim Leary said in his psychology work is that a lot of habits get formed by age 25. So if you want to think of there were people that were 25 in 1970, those were people born in 1935. So, 25 in 1960, they were born in 1935. And then the 1945 people were really the tail end of that, not the beginning. Not the beginning of it. They were the tail end of that. So, and really, things started to change, I think, pretty dramatically around 1976. That was a very important year, and things like fashions and whatnot started changing quite a bit then from what I could see. So I'm not a huge fan of this film. I do think it shows a little bit of how people apply the Strauss-Howell theory of history. And I think you may get some benefit from that. But I would also read some of the articles I'll link to in the description before you watch the film, just to give you a perspective on this. And I encourage you to do so, and go into this understanding this is a partisan prognostication. This is not a, I don't think they even cared that much about accuracy. They cared about kind of organizing the faithful, and you have to look at that in this context. Randall Burns signing off for today. I hope to get back to you soon. Thank you very much for your support on this channel. I really appreciate it. Do hit the like button. Do subscribe. I'm going to try to make the quality of my videos, I'm going to try to start improving that. You may see some of that in the version of this that I post. Thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.